My name's Jeffrey Scott Hornoff, and I'm a police officer. I was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Every step of the judicial system failed me and my family. And if not for the guilt and remorse of the true killer, I'd still be in prison.
She died, I killed her.
Why would you not want to ensure that California stops putting innocent people in prison? It's a very good question.
I was locked up when I was 20 years old, just turned 20 years old. And I'm 42 now, so I've been in a little over 22 years.
It was hard for my father to explain to me. I got convicted of raping somebody, but Daddy didn't do it. So it's like, how you not do it, Daddy, if you've been in here for all these years now?
Everything in your life is wonderful, and then one day, somebody comes up and tells a lie on you and you end up in jail. What's different is he knows fear doesn't exist.
When they told me rape, robbery, possession of instrument of crime, gun, conspiracy, all these, I'm like, oh my God, you know, just it's almost like 100 years in jail for something you didn't do, and I'm really scared.
I was in shock because I got found guilty.
I looked him right in the face, and I said, you and I both know I didn't kill anyone. And he couldn't look me in the eye.
He sentenced me to all that time, and I didn't know what to expect in prison. You know, I expected be beaten, be raped. I expected to die in prison.
The government has failed the exonerated.
It's finally over. It's been 19 years. What now? Go home.
Today, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines in Justice in America, Darrel Parker's story, to examine how Herb and Dan Friedman, partners at the Friedman Law Offices, successfully won $500,000 under the Nebraska Wrongful Conviction Act in a rare public apology from the state's Attorney General for Darrel Parker, as shown in this exclusive ABC News report.
Live from Lincoln, this is Channel 8 Eyewitness News at 5 in high definition.
Now I can die in peace.
After decades of trying to clear his name of murder, today Darrel Parker can finally say he's an innocent man.
Where other people may have given up, Darrel Parker fought even harder. The 80-year-old says he knew this day would come.
Congratulations. I'm sorry. Thanks again, John.
It's an apology Darrel Parker has been waiting to hear for 56 years. His wrongful murder conviction was finally overturned Friday. Nebraska Attorney General John Brewing declaring him innocent.
I'm hopeful that this apology, this acknowledgement of your innocence, will bring some measure of closure for you and your loved ones.
In 1955, Parker's wife, Nancy, was raped and killed inside this home. The former Lincoln Forester was convicted of first-degree murder and spent 13 years in prison after giving a false and coerced confession. Fast forward 30 years when it's revealed that an ex-convict admitted to killing Nancy and 12 other people. Parker thinks back to what he once told a fellow prisoner.
And I told him, as long as I live, I shall fight this.
That fight is now over, but it didn't always look so promising. Just a week ago, the state was prepared to fight Parker's case in court, to take it to trial. But Bruning says it was time to finally do the right thing.
I called my chief of staff at 7:30 on Saturday morning and said, are you thinking about this? Because I'm thinking about this and it's bothering me. What are we doing?
It's been a long battle for the 80-year-old. And he credits his faith and wife of 41 years, Ellie, for helping him to get through it. Now, Parker says he's ready to go back to the Yellow House, where his life was forever changed.
The eagle has landed. Only in the U.S. of A. could we have made an ending like this. Now, my dear Nancy can rest in peace.
In addition to Parker's record being exonerated, he will also get $500,000 in compensation for his wrongful conviction.
Bad police work, junk science, faulty eyewitness identifications, bad defense lawyers, lazy prosecutors, as well as arrogant prosecutors. Our criminal justice system is supposed to err on the side of innocence, sifting the clearly guilty from those less obviously culpable. Imprisoning or condemning the innocent exposes a host of procedural defects in our criminal justice system. Justice must be our eternal aspiration, but we should greet skeptically those who ever claim it's been fully achieved. No one knows better than the person wrongfully imprisoned how unjust his situation is. Even devoted loved ones and dedicated lawyers can never have the same certainty as Darrel Parker, who knew absolutely he was not guilty. And in the end, Darrel Parker's story is an eyewitness account to the epitome of human isolation. Wronged, separated from society and loved ones, and trapped in an existence defined by what Darrel alone knew without a doubt to be a lie. The Insider Exclusive presents this true story, a story of final justice. Justice in America, Darrel Parker's story. It's a testament to his resilience, his family, and his lawyers, Herb and Dan Friedman of the Friedman Law Offices, who got him justice. Darrel's story is a reminder that freedom is not merely a matter of confinement, but also the chance to dwell with the truth. Herb and Dan have earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as some of the best trial lawyers in Lincoln, in Nebraska, and in America. They have seen many innocent and hardworking people become victims of the police and prosecutorial misconduct. They understand that prosecutorial and police misconduct is one of the most serious, enduring, and divisive human rights violations in the United States. The problem is not just in Lincoln, but nationwide, and its nature is institutionalized. And because of that, they are driven to fight for people who have been harmed by the willful or negligent actions of others. Their goals? Not only to get justice for their clients, but to make sure all Americans have the right to a fair trial, honest cops, impartial prosecutors, and fair judges with no agendas. Because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Lincoln, Nebraska. It is my great pleasure to introduce Herb and Dan Friedman to the show. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tell our audience a little bit about your firm. What kind of cases do you handle?
This is a law firm that handles primarily personal injury litigation on behalf of injured people. And we've been doing it really all my professional career. But for about the last 30 years or so, we've specialized in that kind of an area. But in addition to that, we've occasionally handled other cases, such as civil rights types of cases.
Right. And one of those cases, and the reason we're here today, is a civil rights case that you initially filed of a gentleman that was wrongfully convicted. And let's talk about Darrel Parker. Who is Darrel Parker?
Darrel Parker is a gentleman in his early 80s. He's retired. He lives in the Quad Cities out in western Illinois, eastern Iowa. And he was the city forester in Lincoln, Nebraska, first city forester back in the mid-50s. Mm-hmm. And he came here out of Iowa State University. And he lived here for about a year or so, and then his wife joined him after they were married. Her name was Nancy. And they lived in a house provided by the city in Antelope Park, just a short distance from where we're sitting right now. And Darrel Parker came home one day for lunch and was expecting to meet Nancy there, and instead he found her savagely raped and murdered in their bedroom.
Mm-hmm. And this was like 1956
1955.
1955.
December 14th, 1955.
Okay. What happened to Darrel after that?
Well, he was in a tremendous amount of shock and emotional anguish that none of us could even potentially fathom.
And he, like everybody else who was innocent, and he's innocent. He was innocent then, he's innocent now, wanted to get to the bottom of this. He wanted to find who did this.
Correct.
So therefore he cooperated with the police, didn't he?
He did cooperate.
And that's where things kind of went wrong for him, didn't it?
Well, The real killer was a man named Wesley Peary.
Right.
And Peary was a sociopath, essentially, who was later tried and convicted for another murder of a woman in Lincoln in the late 1960s. Peary was working as a groundskeeper and had put up a fence with the groundskeeping crew around the Parker home because the Parkers had experienced a break-in. And he had cased the property and planned his crime when they were, ironically enough, putting up a security fence.
Right.
After the murder, Darrel went to, there was a funeral in Iowa, back where Nancy was from, and Darrel went to spend some time with his in-laws, can't recall Nancy's maiden name. Morris, the Morrises,
yeah.
in the Des Moines area. And he was mourning his wife, and he had been heavily sedated in the week or so after the murder and the funeral. He was called by the Lancaster County attorney and asked to come back to Lincoln, ostensibly to help with the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
He said he would come, and he left very early the next morning and drove from Des Moines back to Lincoln. Nowadays, it's a 3-hour drive. Back then, it's a 5-hour drive before the interstate highway system. He arrives in Lincoln, goes to the Nebraska State Patrol headquarters, and is led into a small, windowless room that's barely bigger than a closet. And he's introduced to a gentleman named John Reed.
Right. Who is a former FBI agent, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And kind of a respected person in his field.
Reed was a very well-respected person in the field of criminology, had written a leading manual on interrogation.
Mm-hmm.
He's deceased now, but he has a company called Reed & Associates, which still exists,
mm-hmm.
which provides training manuals and training services for
mm-hmm.
law enforcement agencies throughout the country.
Mm-hmm.
And Reed was an early user of polygraph technology, and Darrel was subjected to an intense, to put it mildly, form of interrogation and questioning all day long.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we're doing this show is, as our audience will quickly learn, Darrel eventually confessed.
Yes.
To murdering his wife when he hadn't done this. So, the question pops up all the time. Why would anybody confess to a crime they didn't do? Which brings us back to John Reed's interrogation and the fact that I believe that he was mentioned in the U.S. Supreme Court decision Miranda, right?
Yes.
He was mentioned by name of people who coerced confessions out of people when they never did it, right?
Yeah, at trial, Reed went into great detail on the methods he used.
Mm-hmm.
Those very same methods were outlined in his interrogation manual
mm-hmm.
and were referenced by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Miranda decision for examples as to why custodial interrogation is inherently coercive.
Yeah.
Reed sat knee to knee with Darrel Parker, wouldn't let him lose eye contact, stroked his face, touched his hair, and basically told him over and over and over again, he did it. You did this. You were mad at your wife because she was sleeping around on you.
Yeah.
There was no evidence of that in the slightest. They were a happy young couple. And this was a man who was easily influenced. He was young. He was in his 20s. He was easily influenced by law enforcement.
Yeah.
Didn't have a clue why they possibly thought he could have done this.
Yeah.
And essentially cracked under pressure. There is some evidence that Darrel Parker was not in his right mind at the time he gave this confession.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At some point during the day, and mind you, he had asked for his father, was not permitted access to his father. He asked to speak with his boss from the Parks Department. He was not allowed to do that. And obviously this is before Miranda. There were he had no rights as a criminal suspect. Or very little of the rights that we know and appreciate today.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they gave him some food, and our client has testified that Reed prepared the food for him with his back to Darrel, gave Darrel the food. Darrel had been on sedation medication for the better part of the time that had elapsed since the murder. He knew what it was like to be drugged. And he felt woozy and tired, wanted to lay down, and Reed forced him to stay up. And after being interrogated and put under extreme psychological duress for the better part of 8 or 10 hours, Mr. Parker gave a false confession.
Yeah, he recanted that confession the next day.
The next day,
Yeah.
they took him to jail that night.
Yeah.
And the next day, they showed him a copy of the signed confession. His lawyer did, and he was shocked that he had done such a thing. He had no recollection of it at all.
Yeah. Now, Darrel eventually went on to be convicted. He served 14 years.
Correct.
And he was ultimately let go.
He was ultimately released on a negotiated habeas corpus petition.
Partly because the real killer made a confession, correct?
That came later in the
Yeah.
proceedings. Mr. Parker was released sometime in 1970, and the matter regarding Peary did not come until 5 or 6 years later.
After he was released. And I want to talk about that because it's kind of like a deathbed confession, correct? His name is Perry. He confessed to murdering 12 people, didn't he?
Yeah, he confessed to murdering a
He
lot of
confessed
people.
to his lawyers.
Correct.
He told his lawyers to keep it confidential.
Yes.
And under client-attorney privilege, they kept it confidential.
That's correct.
Is
Until
that right?
the agreement was that they would keep his confession confidential until he passed away.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. Darrel Parker was released not because of that confession, but because the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit ruled that the confession was coerced, was the product of coercion.
They actually remanded it, didn't they?
The U.S. Court of Appeals said this confession is bad, and without that evidence, there is no evidence of guilt, and he should walk. The U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the case and said, well, the confession might have been coerced, but the real procedure is to have the trial court back in Lincoln have a new hearing on that issue and determine whether the confession was in fact coerced.
Okay.
At that point in time, Mr. Parker, with the advice of his lawyer, made a calculated decision that he could either have a new hearing and potentially be exonerated and get his freedom, or he could potentially go back to the penitentiary if they found that the confession was not coerced, or he could take a deal.
So he took a deal.
He took a deal where his prison term was commuted and he was paroled, but he allowed the court to enter an order that the confession was voluntary.
Now, ultimately, he was pardoned.
Yes, 20 years after he was released, he was pardoned.
And in 2009, Nebraska passed a wrongful conviction act, correct?
A wrongful conviction compensation act, correct.
Where a person who had been wrongfully convicted could get compensation for the years they spent in jail, up to $500,000 or whatever.
Yeah, the maximum permissible under the law is $500,000 worth of compensation.
And there was you had to meet a certain requirements. There was difficulty getting him qualified, if you will, but ultimately the state of Nebraska, the Attorney General, issued a public apology to him, and he received his compensation.
Correct. It was a rather incredible case because the Attorney General's office went from filing a motion to dismiss the case to throw it out completely, and within the space of about 10 days did an about face and essentially rolled over and agreed with us and capitulated completely.
One of the reasons we do shows like this is because there is a lot of confusion by people thinking that if you're arrested by the police that maybe you are probably guilty, otherwise why would they arrest you, right? And there have been, I looked at the figures here, 302 post-conviction DNA exonerations as of this day. The leading causes of wrongful conviction are DNA exoneration, irrefutable proof regarding DNA, eyewitness misidentification in many, many cases, and false confessions. So the issue comes up, and speaking about Darrel was a college graduate. Darrel wasn't stupid.
Correct.
So a lot of people might ask, well, why would you confess if you're not stupid, you didn't do it, you realize this might happen, you might go to prison for the rest of your life. And today, fortunately, the Innocence Project has lent us a video of an individual. His name is Chris Ochoa. who was 18 years old, who, similar kind of situation, was forced into agreeing to a confession. And we're going to go to that video right now just so people can understand the pressure that police use sometimes in these illegal tactics to coerce a confession. So let's look at that right now.
In 1988, I was accused of a crime, convicted in 1990, I believe, of a murder and a rape that I didn't commit. Served 12 years in the Texas prison on a life sentence before I was exonerated through DNA evidence and through the real perpetrators, the real murderers' confession. When I was first brought in for questioning by the Boston Police Department on this murder and rape, they told me they came up to the Pizza Hut and they said they want to talk to me about burglary. And I said, sure. And I went with them, and they drove me to the police station, and when they were driving me, I had never been in prison before, or in trouble, or any kind of trouble. I've been with Mr. Straight A. I was brought up to, trust the police officers over there to protect me, they were there not to hurt me. So I answered the questions as much as I could, what I knew, but I knew nothing about this murder and rape. But they took it as a sign that I was covering up something, and they kept on saying that I had something to do with it, I'm just lying, I'm not being truthful. And this went on and on for like several hours, and then this came with threats that if I didn't cooperate, I didn't tell them the truth, I was going to go to death row because it was a capital murder, and I was going to die on death row. And ultimately, after many hours of interrogation and threats, I just was wore down, and I told them what they wanted to hear. I was in jail for a while. My mom got sick. They were calling my mom and telling her that if I didn't cooperate, I was going to die in prison. I was going to get not die in prison, but get the lethal injection. You don't want your son to die. Just basically threatening her. And she would call me and tell me, you need to confess. You need to not confess. I'll plead guilty. And I said, I'm not going to plead guilty. I didn't do this. I didn't do this. But eventually she got like a stroke or something, just because of all the stress. And when I heard that, I just, tears in my eyes. It was the hardest decision. People think that it was so easy for me to make this decision, but it was the hardest decision I had to make. I remember calling whoever I had to call, and like, I knew what I was doing. Didn't want to, but I don't want my mom to suffer anymore.
Both of you handle many types of cases, and these type of civil rights cases where somebody's been wrongfully convicted really brings you back to why you became a lawyer, why you do what you do, right? What sense of accomplishment did you feel by getting Darrel his exoneration, by getting his compensation? What did both of you feel?
It was the greatest moment of my career. Representing injured people is what we do, and there's no greater injury than being victimized by a horrible, violent crime, and then being further victimized by your own government, trying to place the blame on you. It destroyed his life.
Well, what also was rare in this case, you had a public apology, didn't you?
Got a public apology, and it was a privilege to represent Mr. Parker. The first time I was ever in a courtroom was watching this case being tried when I was a pre-law student at the University of Nebraska back in 1956. I ended up building a house right across the street from the park where this happened. So this career, this lawsuit, in many respects, bookended my entire career.
It started your career, and you're still practicing, right?
It's towards the end of it, though.
It's in the twilight of your career.
It's in the twilight of the career. It was a privilege representing Darrel. There was a wrong that had been clearly done, and the state of Nebraska stepped forward and actually admitted that that's what happened.
Well, you guys did a great job, and we're proud of you. Darrel's proud of you, and we're glad you were on our program. Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.